When Karen towed his truck for ruining the view, Zach didn't just fight back. He sparked a suburban revolution. Buckle up for a storm of pettiness, power, and poetic justice. The quiet suburb of Shelburne Grove had always prided itself on pristine sidewalks, identically trimmed hedges, and mailboxes painted in HOA-approved sunset taupe. It was the kind of neighborhood where deviations stood out like ketchup on white linen. And to Karen Lakewood, president of the Homeowners Association, few things were more offensive than the sight of Zach Mercer's old Ford F-250 pickup, parked proudly in his driveway. Zach wasn't the kind of man who blended into suburbia. A former mechanic turned small business owner, he had bought the house 2 years ago with his own hands, sweat, and every cent he'd saved. The truck, with its matte blue coat and toolbox-laden bed, was more than transportation. It was his mobile workshop, livelihood, and frankly, an extension of his personality. It ran like a dream and looked like it meant business, which, according to Karen, was precisely the problem. On a sunny Wednesday morning, Karen marched up Zach's walkway with her HOA-issued clipboard like a sheriff entering hostile territory. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "Mr. Mercer," she began, squinting judgmentally at the truck. "This vehicle is in clear violation of HOA standards. It's visually disruptive and undermines the uniform aesthetic of our community." Zach, in the middle of changing the oil on a neighbor's snowblower, stood up, wiped his hands on a rag, and arched a brow. "Visually disruptive? It's a truck, not a strobe light." Karen sniffed. "The bylaws prohibit commercial-looking vehicles parked in plain sight, and this," she gestured dramatically to the F-250, "looks like it belongs at a construction site, not in Shelburne Grove." He folded his arms. "This driveway? Private property. The truck, registered, insured, and clean. Unless you've got a law I don't know about, it stays." Her lips thinned into a line. "There have been complaints." He tilted his head. "From who?" "My neighbors wave every morning. You the only one frowning." Karen didn't answer. Instead, she offered a warning smile. "Consider this your official notice. I suggest you comply or face escalating penalties." Zach didn't budge. "Tell you what, why don't you and your clipboard turn around and write that notice somewhere else?" And with that, he turned back to his snowblower. Karen walked off, heels clicking, already plotting. Zach might have dismissed her, but she never took no as the final word. Karen Lakewood didn't take rejection lightly, especially not public, confident, oil-smeared rejection from a man who had the nerve to imply that her authority, was optional. The moment she stepped back onto the HOA's sacred pavement, clipboard clutched like a holy text. She vowed this would not be the end. It was only the beginning. Within days, Zach began receiving a string of increasingly absurd violation notices. First, it was his excessive vehicle visibility. Then, his trash bins were declared improperly stored, even though they were in the same spot they'd always been. Next came a citation for non-conforming mailbox paint. A laughable accusation, since Zach's mailbox was HOA approved and unchanged since he moved in. Each notice was signed in the same pinched handwriting and filed under anonymous complaints. But Zach didn't need a forensic analyst to guess who was behind it all. When he called the HOA office to challenge the citations, he was met with robotic responses. These concerns were brought to our attention by residents, and we must take action to preserve community standards. But every neighbor Zach spoke with shrugged in confusion, or more often, in exasperated sympathy. "You know it's Karen," one said over the fence. She tried to write up my garden gnome for unapproved whimsy. Another added, she banned a kid's lemonade stand last summer because it clashed with the neighborhood color scheme. Still, Karen doubled down. She began patrolling the street during her morning walks, pausing in front of Zach's house with dramatic sighs and exaggerated note-taking. She once stood motionless for 10 full minutes, peering at his truck like it was emitting gamma radiation. It would have been comical had it not been so maddening. Zach, of course, wasn't one to roll over. Instead of hiding his truck, he leaned into the madness. One morning, neighbors awoke to find a banner strung between his porch posts that read, "Proud owner of the most offensive truck in Shelburne Grove. You're welcome." He stuck googly eyes on the grill and added a bumper sticker that said, Karen's favorite. And while Karen fumed, the neighborhood laughed. Children pointed and giggled, neighbors gave Zach high fives, and someone even left a pastry box on his porch labeled, "Support for Suburban Freedom Fighters." Yet, as the humor spread, so did Karen's determination. Zach's defiance wasn't just a nuisance anymore. It was contagious. So, she went further. A flyer appeared in mailboxes titled, "A Call for Aesthetic Responsibility." In it, she warned that lower visual standards would lead to property devaluation and suburban decay. Though unsigned, the clip art of a pickup truck with red X's over it made the author unmistakable. Karen had declared war, and Zach knew it was time to gear up. It was a crisp Friday morning when Zach opened his front door with a steaming mug in hand, ready to greet the day like he always did. With a sip of coffee and a glance at his loyal truck. But the driveway was empty. Completely, unnervingly empty. His heart lurched. He stepped forward in disbelief, blinking hard, as if his eyes might adjust and conjure the massive Ford F-250 back into existence. Nothing. Only the faint imprint of tire tracks on the pavement, like a ghost had driven off in the night. He dropped the mug. It hit the concrete with a dull crack, shattering like his composure. Someone had taken his truck. He stormed to the curb and scanned the street. No signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no clues. Only a small laminated notice taped to his mailbox, flapping slightly in the breeze, like a smug little flag of tyranny. Notice of towing. Vehicle removed. Per HOA violation 3.2b. Commercial vehicle presence deemed disruptive to neighborhood character. Zach read it 3 times, jaw clenched tighter with each pass. His hands shook with fury as he crumpled the paper in his fist. She didn't, he muttered. She wouldn't dare. But she had. He called the number listed, and after a tedious hold, filled with bad jazz and worse customer service, he confirmed it. The truck had been towed at 3:47 a.m. under HOA directive. The timing wasn't coincidental. Karen had orchestrated this like a mafia hit. The tow yard was 20 miles out of town, and they'd already started charging storage fees. Driving his backup sedan, an aging Honda that coughed every time it turned left, Zach reached the lot with fire in his eyes. He had to sign 3 forms and pay $385 to reclaim his own property. The truck, thankfully, was untouched, but the indignity of it all gnawed at him like rust. As he drove it back through the neighborhood, the truck seemed louder than ever, defiant, thunderous, glorious. Neighbors looked up as he passed. A few even applauded. Someone gave a thumbs up from a lawn chair, and standing at the end of her driveway, arms crossed and eyes blazing behind dark sunglasses, was Karen. Zach slowed the truck as he passed her. For a brief moment, they locked eyes. "You crossed the line," he said, voice low but steady through the open window. Karen tilted her head, smug as ever. "Just enforcing the rules." He drove off without another word before the rage bubbling in his chest could turn into something unwise. That night, after the adrenaline cooled and the bitterness remained, Zach sat on his porch in silence. His dog lay at his feet, snoring softly. The truck gleamed under the porch light. A symbol now, not just a tool. He thought about retaliation, thought about lawyers. He even drafted an email to a local attorney specializing in HOA abuse. But as he looked out over the quiet street, he remembered the faces of his neighbors. The ones who'd stopped by with donuts, who'd laughed at his banner, who had their own gripes with Karen, but never had the nerve to say so. And in that moment, he made a choice. He wouldn't sue, not because she didn't deserve it. She did, and then some, but because this war was bigger than one act of spite. It was about drawing a line, standing tall, and letting her know he wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, a new sign appeared beside the truck. Returned from exile. Miss me? It was petty. It was perfect. And Zach felt a little better already. If Karen thought the truck's disappearance would teach Zach a lesson, she was about to learn the kind of man she was dealing with. Zach Mercer wasn't the type to back down after one hit. If anything, the attack had clarified things. This wasn't just about a truck. It was about control. About a woman so consumed by power that she'd weaponize bylaws over a paint-chipped bumper. And now, Zach was done playing defense. The very next day, he made a trip to the local hardware store and came back with a vengeance. That evening, neighbors gathered slowly, drawn by the sound of hammering and the occasional rogue curse word. By sundown, Zach had mounted a set of bright floodlights pointed directly at his driveway, illuminating the truck like it was on display at a car show. Below it, a platform made from reclaimed wood and bricks gave the Ford a literal pedestal. On the side of the platform hung a wooden sign carved with care. Official Monument to Working Class Freedom, HOA disapproved. It was over the top, it was hilarious, and it was impossible to miss. Cars slowed down to look, teenagers took selfies, an elderly neighbor laughed so hard he spilled his iced tea. Karen? She was livid. The next HOA newsletter, written entirely by Karen and mailed to every household in an envelope labeled Urgent Community Alert, was 4 pages long. It detailed the ongoing threat of anti-HOA sentiment and warned that Zach's public glorification of code violations was encouraging visual anarchy. She even included grainy photos of Zach's display, circled in red like it was a police bulletin. Zach's counterattack continued. He offered free oil changes to neighbors who stopped by with coffee. He held a neighborhood maintenance day, where he helped trim hedges, fix leaky hoses, and repair fences, all for free. Every favor he did, he credited as funded by proceeds from HOA fines. The joke spread fast. Then came the sign. On a slow Wednesday morning, neighbors awoke to find a new addition on Zach's front lawn, a 6-foot-tall cardboard cutout of Karen, arms crossed, clipboard in hand. A speech bubble had been added above her head. "Is that a speck of dirt on your welcome mat?" Zach claimed it was art and stapled a printed copy of the First Amendment to the back. Karen tried to get it removed, first by HOA order, then by police complaint. Neither worked. The cops reportedly chuckled and said it was weird but legal. But the true blow came at the next HOA meeting. Zach showed up with a manila folder full of counter complaints, photos of Karen inspecting properties without permission, and even a video clip of her trespassing on a neighbor's lawn to measure hedge height. When he stood to speak, the room went silent. "I'm not here to fight the HOA," he said. "I'm here because the HOA has become one person, and that person cares more about the color of my truck than the people who live here." The applause was cautious at first, but it grew. People were fed up with the fines, the fear, the micromanagement. Zach had done more to help the neighborhood in a week than the HOA had in a year. Karen sat stiffly, her lips pursed so tightly they nearly vanished. Zach walked out of the meeting, not just with more support, but with something deeper. The tide had shifted. Neighbors who once waved politely now stopped to chat. He was no longer just the guy with the truck. He was the guy who stood up. The morning air smelled of damp earth and static. Clouds loomed over Shelburne Grove like dark curtains waiting to drop, heavy with the promise of something more than just rain. The local forecast had called it a brief but intense spring system. That was meteorologist speak for "you're about to get walloped." Zach, ever the practical one, had been watching the radar since dawn. He'd seen this sort of pattern before. Fast-moving, high-pressure, lots of water in very little time. By 9 a.m., he had already unpacked his stash of sandbags, cleared the storm drains near his curb, and started helping his elderly neighbors lift valuables off their basement floors. Meanwhile, across the street, Karen Lakewood stood on her porch in a pristine cream cardigan, scowling at the sky like it had personally offended her. The HOA meeting she'd been planning for 2 weeks, the one where she intended to formally motion for Zach's community sanction, was that very evening. She had binders. She had laminated agenda cards. She had even printed placards with the slogan, "Protect the aesthetic. Protect our value." What she didn't have, as it turned out, was a backup pump. At exactly 11:32 a.m., the clouds broke like a dam. Rain poured from the heavens with all the grace of an upturned fire truck. In mere minutes, the storm gutters overflowed, turning driveways into miniature rivers. Zach's neighborhood group chat exploded with messages. One simply read, "Basement's taking on water. Help." Karen, however, didn't check the chat. She was too busy yelling into the phone with a city dispatcher, trying to demand someone do something about the water cascading into her backyard like a determined salmon run. It wasn't until she opened the basement door and saw the first 3 inches of water creeping across her tile that the seriousness hit her like a wet slap. She bolted outside, heels slipping in the mud, rain turning her neat bun into limp spaghetti. She went door to door, knocking, shouting over the downpour. "Do you have sandbags? Tarps? Anything?" Most doors didn't open. Those that did showed sympathetic but overwhelmed faces. "I already gave mine to the Jeffersons," one neighbor said, pointing toward the cul-de-sac where a family was frantically stacking bags along a flooded garage. Panic bloomed inside her. Her prized rec room was below ground. Her Peloton, her dehumidifier, her leather-bound HOA bylaws collection. All down there. Drenched. Ruined. And then she saw it. Across the street, like some kind of wartime command post, Zach's driveway was a hive of coordinated chaos. Zach, soaked to the bone but grinning like a general with a plan, was tossing sandbags out of his truck bed to a line of neighbors who passed them down like a fire brigade. His dog, wearing a yellow raincoat, barked with purpose. Kids in galoshes cheered as a garden shed was saved from floating away. It was efficient. It was fast. And it was working. Karen hesitated. Her pride curled up inside her like a threatened cat. She had declared him a menace, tried to get his truck outlawed, had his vehicle towed in the dead of night. And now, here he was, the man with the offensive truck, saving the neighborhood one soggy bag at a time. Still, the water was rising. She stepped into the street, rain smacking her face like shame with velocity. Zach looked up as she approached, his hands mid-pass with a bag. Their eyes met. "Zach," she said, yelling over the storm, voice cracking more than she meant it to. "Do you Do you have any sandbags to spare? The silence between them lasted just a moment, but felt infinite. Then slowly he raised an eyebrow and grinned. I do, he said, but I should warn you. They clash with most HOA-approved landscaping. A laugh burst from someone in the crowd. Karen flinched. She nodded stiffly, teeth clenched. Noted. Without another word, Zach tossed her 2 bags. She caught one awkwardly and nearly dropped it, splashing into the rising water around her ankles. Drenched, humiliated, she dragged the bags back across the street like trophies of surrender. Later, as the rain tapered off and the water began to recede, the damage became clear. Her basement was wrecked, furniture bloated, a file cabinet overturned, its contents curling like damp leaves. The bylaws? Gone. And still, Karen refused to cry. She sat on the top step of her back porch, wrapped in a blanket offered by a child she didn't know, sipping cocoa that Zach's wife had brought over just because. For the first time in a long time, Karen was speechless. Not because she lacked opinions, but because the HOA rules had failed her. And the man she'd tried to drive out had saved her from losing even more. The flood had washed away more than mud. It had washed away her power. The storm passed, but what it left behind wasn't just water damage and ruined carpets. It left cracks in the foundation of Karen's authority. Real cracks, the kind that no policy memo or HOA newsletter could patch up. In the days following the flood, something shifted in Shelburne Grove. The once quiet grumblings of residents evolved into something louder, firmer, and impossible to ignore. It began with a simple email. One neighbor, Mr. Doyle from Maple Lane, sending a message to the HOA mailing list with the subject line, "We need to talk about Karen." In it, he recounted how Zach, not the HOA, had helped him save his basement, how Zach brought his family sandbags, stayed until midnight redirecting runoff, and didn't once ask for anything in return. The email ended with a sentence that lit a fire under the neighborhood. When it mattered, our president was nowhere to be found. But the man she's tried to expel was leading the charge. The thread exploded. Stories poured in. The Nguyen family mentioned how Zach had reattached their gutters in the storm. Mrs. Hastings wrote about how he rescued her garden gnomes and replanted them post-flood. Even the reclusive teenager from House 14 chimed in with a meme of Karen floating on a raft labeled Ho Power, while Zach stood on a sandbag mountain marked Community. Within 48 hours, the HOA office was swamped, not with water this time, but with formal complaints. A petition began circulating calling for an emergency board meeting to discuss Karen's leadership. It reached quorum in less than a day. Karen, of course, resisted. She sent out an email titled, "Clarifying My Role During the Flood," where she explained at length that she had been coordinating efforts remotely and that the chaos had made it impossible to enforce standard emergency procedures. It was 5 paragraphs of bureaucratic deflection. Not once did it mention the fact that she'd personally asked Zach for help. The residents weren't buying it. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening, held in the community center that Karen had once insisted be painted eggshell serenity to match HOA guidelines. The turnout was unprecedented. People came early. Chairs ran out. Some stood along the walls. Zach, reluctant at first, was nudged forward by a dozen neighbors until he finally agreed to speak. Just as a concerned citizen. He didn't need theatrics. He spoke plainly. He talked about community, not conformity. About showing up, not showing off. He didn't point fingers, but he didn't have to. Every resident there had lived the difference between Karen's rulebook and Zach's actions. When Karen stood to respond, it was too late. Her words stumbled. Her voice cracked. Gone was the commanding posture, the unwavering tone. She tried to rally one last defense, blaming weather, miscommunication, and, in a final desperate grasp, even Zach's truck, which she claimed obstructed vital visual lines during emergency response. That drew laughs, not polite ones, open, cathartic ones. The vote to remove her was swift and nearly unanimous. Only 2 abstained, and one of them was Karen. A new vote followed. Who should take her place? At least temporarily, until formal elections. Could be held. Hands shot up. Before names were even nominated. Zach Mercer, someone said. There was a pause. Then a wave of agreement that swept through the room like a gust of fresh, post-storm air. Zach tried to decline. He really did. But as voices around him began to chant his name in a suburban, modest, HOA meeting kind of way, he finally smiled and nodded. "I'll serve," he said, "but only if we change the bylaws so no one ever has this much power again." The cheers that followed echoed down the manicured streets of Shelburne Grove, and across the road, watching from her darkened living room window, Karen sat in silence, not just defeated, dethroned. Her name no longer struck fear. Her clipboard no longer carried weight. The queen had fallen, and the kingdom had never looked more united. The air in Shelburne Grove felt different now, lighter, easier to breathe. The lawns were still neat, the mailboxes still matching, but the neighborhood no longer carried the tension of unsaid frustrations and quiet fear. People waved more freely. Laughter returned to porches. The HOA, once a looming presence with clipboards and veiled threats, had transformed into something closer to what it was always supposed to be, a group of neighbors, helping neighbors. Zach Mercer never imagined himself sitting at the head of an HOA meeting, much less willingly. And yet there he was, sipping lemonade instead of black coffee, leading a discussion not about hedge lengths or mailbox fonts, but about starting a neighborhood tool library and setting up an emergency preparedness plan. The kind of practical, common-sense ideas that made people feel safe, not scrutinized. He watched as people, the same ones who used to avoid speaking up, now debated passionately about flood barriers and volunteer rotas. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Still, beneath the satisfaction, Zach carried a quiet heaviness. He wasn't a man who took joy in someone else's downfall, even someone like Karen. He'd spent years under her petty rule, felt the sting of her cruelty, and had every reason to celebrate her collapse. But now, watching the community come alive without her, he felt something closer to pity than triumph. That pity didn't last long. Late one evening, just as he was locking up his garage, Zach heard the unmistakable hiss of air escaping from rubber. He turned the corner and saw it, his truck's rear tire sagging low to the ground. Another hiss followed. He ran over just in time to see a hunched figure in a dark hoodie crouching beside the front tire, fumbling with something shiny. "Hey!" Zach shouted. The figure bolted, but not before the porch motion light revealed a face he knew all too well. Karen. The ridiculousness of it hit him mid-stride. Karen, sabotaging tires like a cartoon villain, in orthopedic sneakers. Zach didn't chase her. He just shook his head, walked back to his garage, and pulled up the footage from his security cameras. Clear as daylight. Full face. Full action. The tool in hand. Even a small moment where she appeared to struggle with the valve cap and muttered, "Stupid thing," to herself. He turned the footage over to the police. When the cruiser came for her the next day, Karen was watering her roses. She tried to act shocked, confused, like the idea of being arrested was beyond the realm of her imagination. But the footage didn't lie. Neither did the criminal charge of vandalism and property damage. Zach didn't watch her get cuffed. He didn't need to. By then, the story had already reached every porch in the neighborhood. The court didn't go easy on her. A hefty $50,000 compensation was ordered in Zach's favor. Damages, legal fees, and emotional distress. She was also sentenced to 60 hours of community service, a punishment she'd serve under the watchful eye of the very she once ruled like a suburban monarch. Zach watched her one afternoon as she picked up trash near the community center. Her face was red, not from sun, but from humiliation. Every time a neighbor walked by, she stiffened, pretending not to notice. But they noticed. Everyone noticed. Zach stood across the street, arms folded, watching in silence. He felt resolved, not joyful, not smug, just done. The war was over. Later that evening, as he stood on his porch, looking out at the street washed clean by spring rains and quieter battles, he let out a long breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Karen's reign had ended. Peace had returned. And for the first time in a long time, Zach felt something rare and real. Home. A month later, Shelburne Grove held its first community block party in over 5 years. Not an HOA-mandated holiday potluck with strict casserole categories. A real to goodness gathering. Grills sizzled, music floated through the air, and kids chalked wild dragons onto the sidewalks without anyone measuring the lines. Zach stood by his newly detailed truck, now adorned with a decal, reading. Certified HOA hazard. Handle with care. He laughed as 2 toddlers ran circles around the front bumper, pretending it was a tank. The highlight of the evening came when old Mr. Farnsworth, the most reserved man on the block, wheeled out a karaoke machine and called for Zach to sing. Zach, mortified but pressured by cheering neighbors, gave in. He butchered Sweet Home Alabama, horribly, gloriously. As he howled through the chorus, people clapped and danced and laughed in a way that only truly free communities do. And just as the song ended, Karen, passing by on her court-mandated cleanup shift, accidentally bumped her trash grabber against a rogue speaker wire, silencing the music completely. Everyone turned. Zach, without missing a beat, lifted his red Solo cup in a mock toast and shouted, "To Karen! Still finding ways to control the volume!" The crowd burst into laughter. Even Karen cracked the faintest, bitterest smile before walking on. And with that, Shelburne Grove roared back to life. Lighter, freer, and finally